Hello and welcome back to All Things Money. I'm your host, David Blain. This is our final segment of today's show. I hope you've been enjoying it. If you're just tuning in, you can always head over to our website, dlblain.com, and we'll post archived copies of the show there in a couple weeks. You can catch up. Did the first two segments today on a couple of good investing lessons about not chasing star performers, avoiding hedge funds, and being very careful with the so-called endowment model and trying to copy other institutions. Well, I wanted to talk a little about this segment about some of the bailouts. It struck me recently, I don't know if you heard on the news, but people in Washington, and I use that, I don't exactly know who, it's just I read a lot and hear a lot, but the general consensus coming from Washington is that AIG, American International Group, which was the world's largest insurer back in 2008, 2009, the federal government bailed them out, and they have repaid their investment. The government has exited their investment, and the word on the street around Washington is that it was successful and that they made a profit on the investment, and thus we should all be so proud of our federal government for injecting money into AIG because we made a profit. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Stay away from the political end of it too much, but really talk about that concept of making a profit. Now, there was a couple of things. Number one, we have in this country what's called a bankruptcy process. Hopefully none of you out there have ever been through it. But if you have, it's designed for individuals and companies that are having financial problems to manage their affairs in an orderly way. And so the argument at the time was firms like AIG were too big, they would cause too many problems if they went through the normal bankruptcy process. So the taxpayer, through Congress and the President, the taxpayers ended up bailing out AIG. And they ended up giving them loans and taking equity and preferred stock and things like that. And what we see in this is a perfect example of crony capitalism and political corruption, in my opinion, the way this whole thing was worked out. You have this sort of circular chair between White House administration. It's not just President Obama. It's been Bush and Clinton, and but this rotation between Wall Street and a White House. Wall Street, White House, lobbyists. Wall Street, White House lobbyists. And so all the people, they're all the same people. They all know each other. They're all, Geithner came from Wall Street, now he's U.S. Treasury. Half the lobbyists either used to be in Congress or used to be on Wall Street. And so you have this little group of people, and you don't know whether they're wearing their government hat, representing the people, or if they're representing Wall Street or whatever. And it's just a very bad situation. So one of the things that's intrigued me about all these bailouts and things like that is, what would happen if they just gave the money to people? In fact, I think maybe we'll explore this on another show, but Martin Luther King and actually some right-wing commentators like Milton Friedman and things like that, they had a concept once of a guaranteed income. Just get away from every government program and have some sort of guaranteed income. Well, along the same vein, and I'm not saying we do this, it's just something I was thinking about, instead of giving all this money to all these Wall Street firms and bailing out, just send every American taxpayer a check, that's basically what they're doing, but it gets filtered down. Anyway, so I looked at what if they, instead of bailing out AIG, if they had given this money to individuals, and instead of investing in AIG and the banks and things like that, they had invested in the U.S. total stock market. And so this is kind of interesting. If you look at the results, all right, and for this particular analysis, I just looked at the Vanguard total stock market, which is large, medium, small companies in the U.S. And if you look at AIG was lent $182.3 billion, and they claim to have made $22.7 billion, the U.S. Treasury realized gain. If you really do the math, though, the tax deductions that AIG received for taking all those losses, wipes out all that gain. Okay, that's never reported. But because they had all these losses, they were able to wipe out any tax that they owed. They were able to carry those losses back. Net operating losses can be carried forward or carried back. Well, they carried them back, and anyway, so we didn't make any money on that. Don't kid yourself. But anyway, if you had invested that same amount of money, $182.3 billion in the total stock market, so small companies, medium companies, large companies, the U.S. Treasury would have made approximately $90 billion instead of investing in AIG. So a little over 4 times the reported number if instead of trying to cherry pick the company, they would have just invested in the stock market. And I know that's kind of a fanciful, fantasy type thing, but it just goes to illustrate that whenever you hear something, you've got to understand what the facts are and look at it critically. That we didn't make $22.7 billion on AIG. Who knows what would have happened if they went through bankruptcy? I realize that. But after the tax write-offs, we didn't make anything. And if you look at the return of the stock market since September 18, 2008, which is when the government gave AIG the $180 billion, and the liquidation of the final stock of AIG in December 2012, you can see that an additional $62.8 billion would have accrued to the taxpayer. Anyway, just kind of something to think about. I realize that there's it's not an exact comparison, and that in September of 2008, people were scared that AIG was going to bring the whole system down. But anyway, the point is that as an investor out there, we want you to look for opportunities, and by trying to cherry pick an individual company is not necessarily the way to go. Even just investing in a basic stock market fund would have made much, much more than investing in AIG. Okay, well, that's kind of what we want to talk about today. And a few other things maybe we'll talk about next week. There's a lot of banter about who the middle class is, and this is a great article I pulled from the Wall Street Journal. If you want to go back to February 15th and look it up, we'll probably talk about this next week, but it goes through and it shows that middle class in America is this sort of nebulous thing that really has no meaning. So maybe we'll talk about that next week. All right, so for All Things Money, I'm your host, David Blain. That's it for today's show. I hope that we'll see you again next week.
The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions expressed are not necessarily those of WNBU and Inner Banks Media.